Hello and welcome to this seminar collaboration between our Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics and Public Policy and the Minda de Gunzburg Center for European Studies at Harvard University, two places that shaped Marvin Kalb, two places that Marvin Kalb shaped back through his years of leadership as the founding director of the Shorenstein Center, as a professor at the Kennedy School, as an alum of our Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, as a friend and alumni mentor to many of our students. Marvin, it's such a pleasure to see you. How are you feeling today?
I'm doing just great. Thank you so much, Vassilis.
We are here primarily to discuss your brand new book, Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War. Congratulations. And
thank you.
Many years ago, I had the honor and pleasure to be one of the many young professionals at the Brookings Institution, where we benefited from your guidance, support, direct feedback, and it's really great to see you back. As I was reading the book, I had to highlight the fact that you managed to bring together your personal journey and tie it into your academic and your professional journey. So I want us to start by going back to the 1950s. Some of us were not around in the 1950s, but you were here. You were right down the street at Harvard.
Yes, indeed.
What were you thinking? What were you planning to do? And what happened?
Well, Vassilis, what happened was that I was a graduate student at the Russian Research Center, and there was an extraordinary cadre of scholars having to do with the Soviet economy, Soviet history, Soviet politics. I was completely absorbed in the study of the Soviet Union with the intent of then going on for a PhD and hopefully being able to teach Russian history either at Harvard or some school like it, if there is one like it. And I got a call one day from the man who ran the Russian Research Center saying that the State Department would love to have somebody in Moscow who spoke Russian, who had a top secret clearance, who could leave in a week, who was not married, and who really wanted to go and sort of look at the Soviet Union. And I was very quick to say yes, ready to go. And in fact, within a week did leave, spent 13 months in the Soviet Union, met many Russians, traveled from one end of the country to another, spoke even with the leader, Nikita Khrushchev, time and time again. He's the one, by the way, who nicknamed me Peter the Great, which is a wonderful story. Maybe we'll get to that. Then I went back to Harvard, and one day, Edwin R. Murrow, the great legendary figure at CBS News, invited me to come down to New York to talk to him about Russia. I did. He offered me a job, and eventually I ended up as the CBS correspondent in Moscow. That was a great honor, privilege, exciting to have that job.
I know you covered a lot about your early days in Moscow in your previous book, The Year I Was Peter the Great.
Yes.
It looks like this is a trilogy, so this is number 2. Why did you write this book?
I wrote this book because I felt there was a wonderful story about Russia that had to be told, a story also about America. And what I mean by that, Vassilis, is that the book is a memoir. It's the story of me as a young man trying to get ahead, trying to become a professor in one way, and then also a journalist in another. And I was able to do that because of the wonderful, rich opportunities that exist in this country, which, with all of its problems, still lays out a vast menu of opportunity for people who want to work very hard and try to make it. And one could say, and I would agree, that in a sense I have made it. And therefore, with this book, I simply, Vassilis, wanted to say thank you to America for giving me that opportunity.
That's a great perspective. And when I was reading your book, you talk a lot about this Europe trip, or this long trip through the world. Your Mady somehow joined you on that, and you
Yes.
went through several countries.
13.
What did that teach you? Incredible. What did that teach you about the importance of being in the field, being out there as a journalist, but also as a scholar?
Well, one of the things, I did this trip with my wife, Madeline, and I wanted to do it because something really bugged me as a journalist and as a budding scholar. And that was, I sensed in 1956, 7, and 8, the beginning of a slow rupturing of the once very strong, powerful alliance between the Soviet Union and Communist China. And if it was true, really true, that there was a fracturing of that alliance, that had enormous geopolitical importance. And it was also a fabulous news story. But you couldn't just go on the air and say, this is what I think. I needed to have evidence. And so what I did was set up a trip in the summer of 1959 to visit 13 countries, starting in London and ending up sort of at the other end of the world in Tokyo, and talking with experts on Russia and China, trying to get their view so that I could pull it all together and have what I thought was a well-grounded conclusion that there was, in fact, the beginning of a rupture in this relationship. And in fact, that happened a little more than 2 years after I did the first story about that rupture.
You are a great storyteller, and you know that. You've heard that through your career as a professional journalist, as a correspondent, as a professor. I recall very vividly a lot of your mentoring sessions to young professionals. You would share some stories. Tell me about the power of storytelling, particularly in moments of crises, in moments of uncertainty. How do stories spearhead the tri-generational approach to issues? How do you bring in memories of the past that can be applied to the present and shape the future?
Well, let me give you a very, very small illustration of that question. When Mady and I arrived in Moscow in May of 1960, we were given a very small room at the Metropole Hotel in the middle of Moscow. The hotel had a storied history, went back to pre-revolutionary times. But in the Soviet time, it had come upon a sorry state. The little room 570 at the Metropole Hotel contained a bed. They said it was a double bed, and they said it would be for people like me. I stood at that time, maybe I've shrunk an inch since then, but I was 6'3", and the bed was, and I measured it, 5'10". Now, if you try to sleep, Vassilis, in a bed 5'10" when you're 6'3", that's a very hard thing to do. And after a week or two, I realized I got absolutely no sleep at all. And I couldn't work and not sleep. So I went down to the in-tourist office and met there with the leader of the office, a woman named Borisovna. And I said, Madame, look at me, please. I am 6'3", and the bed that you've given me is 5'10". I don't fit in it. Could you please get me a larger bed? And she said, Mr. Kalb, this bed is given to all foreign correspondents. You are a foreign correspondent. That is the bed. I said, but I don't fit in it. And she would say, you have to get used to it. And believe me, Vassilis, I tried. I tried for a week or two. It simply didn't work. The bed didn't grow and I didn't shrink. So I went down and finally, in desperation, I sent a letter to my boss in New York. I said, you may not know this as yet, but I have not got a night's sleep since I've arrived here because I don't fit into my bed. Would you do me a favor and send my bed, which is in my in-laws' home in a small town in New Jersey, South Orange, send it to me in Moscow? I fully expected them to laugh at the idea and reject it. But I got word one day that our bed, pillows, pillowcases, sheets, the whole works were being airmailed from South Orange, New Jersey to Moscow. Now I have to tell you immediately that that was a sign in those days of the way a foreign correspondent would be treated by the Home Office. I doubt that that would happen today. We live in a new world of journalism, but in those days, they really wanted to make the foreign correspondent happy, particularly the one in Moscow, which was the major story in the Cold War. That's these things people tend to forget today. I understand why. But in the Cold War, there were two major forces, one led by the Soviet Union, the other by the United States, in a global conflict. Each had nuclear weapons. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 62, we were very close to an exchange of nuclear weapons that would have destroyed the world. So it was a tough, dangerous time. It was the responsibility of the American reporter in Moscow to try to get the story out to the American people as best he could.
As a reminder to our viewers, we are here to discuss Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War, with gratitude, of course, to the Shorenstein Center and its director, Nancy Gibbs, who was not able to join us today, and of course, Liz Schwartz, who is behind the scenes and has been instrumental in making this discussion possible. I have one more question before we begin bringing in some of the other questions that I see from the Q&A. If anyone in the audience has ever had a bed airmailed to them, please let us know, because that's quite a story. Quite a story, Marvin.
Thank you.
One of your most exciting parts of your book was the story that involved a croissant. And as a journalist, I have an understanding you had to travel a lot. You had to wake up early in the morning. But there was one particular story in that one morning that gave you an incredible exclusive. And I wish somebody could transfer that into a movie, because that would be a great story to see. But help us visualize what you went through that morning.
Well, it was very exciting story. It was mid-May of 1960. A very important summit meeting was taking place, or supposed to take place, in Paris. Khrushchev was there, of course, for the United States, and President Eisenhower, Khrushchev for the Soviet Union, President Eisenhower for the United States, and Macmillan from Britain and de Gaulle from France. Very crew gathered around in our office in Paris, and we figured out what it is that we were going to do. My responsibility was to cover Khrushchev. And I knew from previous experience that whenever Khrushchev traveled anywhere, he loved to get up very early in the morning and take a walk. I suggested to the foreign editor of CBS, give me a crew. I will be there in front of the Soviet embassy at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Let's see what happens. We might be able to get an exclusive interview. He gave me the crew. I went there exactly 7 a.m. The doors of the Russian embassy opened. Khrushchev emerged with 2 bodyguards. I saw this and rushed toward him with our crew. The 2 bodyguards intervened immediately, reached into their pockets, obviously for weapons. When Khrushchev saw me, and he looked at the guards and says, "No, no, no, he's okay. He's Peter the Great." And which went back to our experience in 1956. And so we started by taking a walk down the street.
Mm-hmm.
We passed a French boulangerie, a bakery shop, and the aroma of freshly baked croissant sort of drifted out into the streets. Khrushchev stopped, took a sniff, and I said, "Mr. Chairman," and we were speaking in Russian back and forth. Mm-hmm. "Mr. Chairman, have you ever had a croissant?" He said, "No." I said, "Would you like one?" He said, "Yes." I ran in and I bought a bunch for him and his guards, for me and my crew. Khrushchev bit into his, and his face lit up in Slavic joy. And he looked at me and he said, "Ochi, of course not. I mean, that's really very good." And I said, "Yes, would you like another?" He said, "No, no, no." And then this was my moment, and I began to ask him about Berlin, about disarmament, about the chances of the summit succeeding. We had for ourselves what we call in journalism a fantastic scoop. And we walked back to the embassy. He went in. I did my on-camera piece, rushed back to the office, and CBS News that night had a big exclusive. And that was my first day as a foreign correspondent on the scene of a story. And I can tell you, Vassilis, that was a heck of a first day. It was quite marvelous.
That's incredible. Not surprisingly, your stories are bringing a lot of responses from the audience. I'm going to bring in a few snippets before Liz help us on the Q&A. One moment I have to share right away. It looks like Monty is talking about the fact that he had a bed built for him during his time in Liberia as a member of the UN Election Advisory Committee, just following Taylor's abrupt departure. Thomas Simmons is here with us. Tell us about an ice cream story and the KGB.
That too is not a bad story. My first day in Russia, it was very, very cold. It was about 30 degrees below zero. And I went for a walk and noticed that there was a KGB guy directly behind me. And I wanted to be sure that I was being followed. And I made sort of detours that they had taught us. Didn't work. He was right there with me all the time. I eventually ended up in Red Square. I looked around. I would try to sneak in one corner, but he was always there. There was no way of my shaking him. And I went into the GUM department store, which is this vast store directly opposite the Kremlin on Red Square. And I noticed there an ice cream stand. I figured, ooh, this is interesting. So I went over to the ice cream stand and bought 2 ice creams. And without turning around, I simply extended my arm back with one, and he took it. And we both stood there side by side eating our ice cream. I tried to strike a conversation with him, but all I could get out of him was the murmur of satisfaction as he licked his ice cream. Mm-hmm. And that sort of made me feel, however, that even with a KGB guy, there had to be some level where the two could meet. And if it be over ice cream, good deal.
There are a lot of people that care deeply about the US-Russian relationship. deep admiration for the culture, the history, have spent time overseas. What is your take in moments of crisis and conflict? Can those two sides still work together?
Vassilis, in this respect, long term, I'm an optimist. Russia and the United States have never fought a war against each other. There were skirmishes right after the Russian Revolution in Siberia, but that was not an organized US government activity against an organized Russian activity. They had never fought, and they still have not fought. They have fought on the same side, but against each other. And Russia has a deep, as you were alluding a moment ago, a deep cultural affinity for the West and also for itself. And the Russians have always been involved in a conflict between Westerners and what are called Slavophiles, people who believed that there was something uniquely wonderful about Russia, and they didn't have to look anywhere else for inspiration. And the Westerner in Russia who believed you had to look to the West. That Russia, when you looked at a map, Russia was half Western, half Asian. So there was this, not a conflict, there was a difficulty in the reconciliation of the histories and culture of the two parts. So Russia has always been a mix, and it's never been an easy country to understand, but it is essential that we do, because conflict between the two would be deadly and satisfy neither national interest of either side.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Liz Schwartz, again, thank you for all your help. Please join us to moderate some of the plenty Q&A we have received. I will start with one question from Ari in New York. Marvin, you came of age professionally in a revolutionary time in media communication. We are now living through another revolution in media. Has the nature of active measures, disinformation campaigns, changed, or is it fundamentally the same?
It's a wonderful question. My own feeling is that in terms of Russian strategy, the idea of using disinformation is not new. That goes back to Tsarist times. And whether Tsarist or communist, the leaders of Russia have always felt that they had to learn as much as they could about the outside world, about them, because they were so locked into their own inability, really, to come up with a satisfactory, unifying vision of Russia. So they keep going east-west, east-west. And they always look with a degree of admiration on the West, but also deep suspicion. And so they wanted to know what's going on, and they used the tools that they had, and they used them very effectively. And they continue to use them very effectively, as they did in the election in the US in 2016, and again last year.
Mm-hmm. Liz, help us out. I see the number of questions increasing by the second.
Yes, we have a lot of great questions. We're going to bring Gregory Pfeiffer on to ask his question. He's just joining us on screen here.
Gregory, welcome.
Gregory, feel free to turn on your camera as well.
Thank you. Give me a second.
There he is.
Hello, Marvin.
Hi there. Long time no see.
Indeed, pandemic times.
Yes.
Thank you. Terrific talk. It's so wonderful to have another Marvin Kalb book to read and great stories to hear, telling stories. So my question is, with stereotypes and antagonism between Russia and the United States as rife as at least some periods during the Cold War, how do you feel about American reporting from Moscow and the rest of the country today? What would you like to see? And what advice would you have to journalists in Russia now, American journalists, for understanding Russians based on what you write in your book?
Thank you, Greg, very, very much. And it's good to see you again. I would say first, I want to see more Western correspondents covering Russia from Russia. I would like to believe that most of them spoke the language. It is incredibly important that a foreign correspondent based in Moscow speak the language of the people. And third, if possible, that these reporters being sent to Russia know something about the history of the country. They're not arriving empty-headed in a way into a very complicated environment. So those three things for me would be absolutely essential. And I would hope that that could happen very quickly, though I have very little expectation that it will. It is extremely important that we get reporters into Russia now. There's not enough reporting from Russia now. And I find it very difficult to imagine why that is the case. It probably has to do with money, and it may even have to do with a belief on the part of the editors that there's no point in sending an American reporter to Russia because the American people are not really interested in anything from Russia. They're interested in what is happening in their country. I fully understand that, but we have to be broader and absorb a more global perspective, which I believe was what President Biden was trying to suggest last night when he spoke to Congress and the American people. And I would hope that the people in Congress took that seriously and began to open up in a positive way toward greater information and greater connectedness to the rest of the world. Thank you, Greg, for the question.
Liz, who should we bring in next?
Yeah, so we have a question from Deborah Mathis, who asks, what would you say some of the biggest misconceptions Americans had about the Soviets then and Russia now?
Terrific question. And a hard one to answer. I think that in the early days, when I was there in the 1950s, early 1960s, the American people knew very, very little about the Soviet Union. They assumed that since it was the principal antagonist of the United States during the Cold War, that it was evil, and there was a lot of evil there, that it was run essentially by a dictator. And Nikita Khrushchev maybe was not an old-fashioned dictator as Joseph Stalin was, but was pretty close to that. And he was an unusual dictator. He tried to reach out to the West, and especially to the United States. He visited the United States in 1959. He made a great success of his visit, eating hot dogs, visiting Hollywood. He was trying to break down the stereotypes. Today, we have not as much of the flat out black and white kind of stereotypes. Russia is today much more open as a society than it was 50, 60 years ago. But it is still essentially a closed society, and Putin is doing his level best to close it even more day by day. I think this is terrible for the Russians, but bad as well for the rest of the world in that it blocks an opportunity for a reasonable discussion between the two sides.
It's great to see, I mean, Deborah, one of your colleagues at the Shorenstein Center, we have a lot of people actually who had the chance to interact with you during your time at Harvard. In fact, I pledge your next book that's coming up, the third one of this trilogy, we should do the book talk in the Marvin Kalb conference room at the Shorenstein Center. Liz, is that possible?
Absolutely. Although we may max out capacity. I don't know. It's a pretty small room. Lovely room.
No, I think, let me quickly intrude here, if I may, and just pick up Vassilis's point about my being the founding director of the Shorenstein Center. That was, for me, those 12 years were among the richest, most satisfying, wonderful years of my life. The center was a fantastic place. And if I gave it direction at that time, who knows? But the important thing was that its impact upon me was tremendous, warm, sympathetic, fantastic. I could go back there anytime.
Well, you know, you're
Liz,
always welcome back at any time, Marvin. We love to
Thank you, Liz. Thank you.
And your founding direction for the center has certainly done it incredibly well over the succeeding years. And I don't think we'd be in the same place if you hadn't been the founding director. So
Thank you.
Thank you for your contributions as well.
Thank you.
Vassilis, should we bring up another question?
I would recommend, Liz, perhaps bundle 2 short ones to maximize our time with Marvin.
Sure. So there are a couple of questions about combining on the fly here, about sort of how the US and Russian relations work now, both in terms of media and disinformation and misinformation, as well as just sort of a broader political landscape. But I guess, Marvin, what's your impression currently of how the US media and potentially politics should respond to Russian media and other activities that affect the world?
Sure. Let me try to answer that question, or a couple of questions, Liz, in the following way. We hear a great deal now about a man named Navalny, who was a Russian political figure and opponent of Putin, and a very unusual opponent of Putin. And he represents a mixture of what I was talking about earlier, Westerner and Slavophile. He's a very uniquely Russian national figure. I don't believe for an instant that he is capable, with the tools that he has, of replacing Putin. Navalny, in a sense, represents soft power, people power, but Putin represents state power, hard power. He can, as he is trying to do right now, crush the Navalny movement. This is a very complicated story. And we're getting it in a flash, sort of black and white. Navalny is portrayed as this romantic, democratic figure. He is not really a democratic figure. Some of his background suggests an association with nationalists in Russia that are not exactly Democrats at all. But he is, at this time, against Putin. And so we in the West, with very little understanding of the environment in which this man emerged, we sort of are instantly sympathetic to him, because he strikes us as anti-Putin, and Putin is the bad guy in our understanding of contemporary Russia. So I guess what I'm saying in a journalism way is, dear journalists, please dig more deeply into this story and tell us what it's really about. What does he represent in Russia? Does he represent just young people? Are there older people? College graduate people? Just hardworking people? What's going on? And I think this would be an incredible service for the American journalists to perform not just for the people in the United States, for all over the world.
I have a question that I received from one of our students. In fact, Mercedes Apupo was part of our Harvard College trip to Washington, D.C. when we visited the Brookings Institution,
Yeah.
and you very kindly gave us your time. Mercedes's question is the following, quote, now that we are seeing an increasing effort by the Kremlin to push independent media and freelance journalists out, how can we promote dialogue and work to bolster the American understanding of Russia, as you discussed, without endangering the human rights of correspondents on the ground?
Well, it's a wonderful question again. I would say that the most important thing we could do right now would be try, although it may be very difficult to succeed at this point, but to try to get as many Americans visiting Russia, working in Russia, living in Russia as it is possible. I say this because what Putin is doing right now is cutting ties between Russia and the rest of the world, building up the military while pressing down on the consumer satisfaction of the Russian people. The Russians are now earning less than they were 10 years ago, and the price of all kinds of goods has gone up in the last 10 years. His own personal popularity has dropped. So I don't regard him as being in a very strong position. Nobody's going to kick him out, but he's not that strong, certainly not as he was. We have to understand what's going on there. The more journalists that are there, as I said earlier, the more diplomats, the more business people, tourists, all of that. Let us get back to the times in the 80s and 90s when all of this was happening and the opportunity for mutual understanding went up rather than down.
Thank you. Liz.
Yeah, we have a question from Eric Bruner, who's wondering about whether you suffered any effects of McCarthyism or other anti-communist backlash, both as a Soviet studies scholar and a Moscow correspondent.
My problems began not with McCarthy. My problems began with Richard Nixon. When he was president of the United States, he had a very, very negative view of the American press corps. And he had a private list of people he detested because of their reporting. And he did not like my reporting on the Vietnam War. I'm sorry that he didn't like it, but that's tough. I broadcast what it is that I thought was happening there and what it is on the diplomatic side that could be done to resolve that conflict. He did not like my reporting, and he put me on what is called an enemies list. And that might have meant that I was denied certain opportunities, certain exclusive stories, certain interviews. Yeah. But you know that it becomes a question for each journalist then. What is it that you would rather do? Would you rather be absolutely honest with yourself and therefore with the American people and just broadcast what you believe to be true? Or would you reach out for goodies that could be dispensed by the Nixon administration? And that would be good for your career and that sort of thing. I wanted to go the former way. That's the way I did go, and ended up on the enemies list. But you know, in a way, the enemies list consisted of some of the finest people in this country. Some of the writers, the Hollywood people, the journalists, authors, doctors, Indian chiefs, all of those people who followed a pro-democratic vision of America.
I want to remind our viewers that we're here to discuss Marvin Kalb's new book, Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War. Liz has very kindly shared the link to learn more about the book. It's a great read, and I very much enjoyed going through it. Liz, perhaps we can ask two at a time, because Marvin, one of the best aspects of hosting this virtually is that we are getting questions from Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Maryland, Europe, Greece, Geneva. So we're trying to bring in as many as possible. So Liz, floor is yours.
Sure. So Benjamin Levy asked, how would you evaluate the quality of international news that Americans get today, especially on television? What recommendations do you have for improving our news? That is sort of two questions in one, so I might leave that and then we can jump to another one.
Yeah, and one of the things to bear in mind, and I suggested this a little earlier, but in no great detail, and that is that we don't have enough foreign news on our television screens. In order to have a foreign correspondent based somewhere, I'm thinking back to my time in Russia, you had a family with you most of the time. You had to have an apartment. You needed a car to get around. Those people who didn't speak Russian needed an interpreter or two. It became an expensive proposition to maintain a Moscow bureau for CBS or the New York Times or any other American news organization. So it was a budget issue as well as a journalistic issue. Was it a major story? Yes, but you also had to be able to afford the coverage. In this day and age, the judgment is being made, unfortunately, that news organizations cannot afford it, so they don't send, as a rule, they don't send correspondents overseas. There are still some news organizations that do, that are very responsible. The New York Times, for example, some of the major networks, CNN, absolutely. They do their job. And I am delighted that they continue to do that. But most of the rest of American journalism does not. And as a result, people who do not watch CNN or CBS, who do not read the New York Times, are essentially denied information about much of the world. And that is most unfortunate.
We have two questions, one from, one from Adita Misra, who asks, how do you think the Trump administration's stance towards Russia will affect US-Russian relations in the long term, if at all? And another question along the same line. So let's leave it at that.
Well, we have to be mindful of the fact that President Trump had an extremely unusual relationship with the Russians and particularly with Putin. When there was a major issue in contention, was Russia actually interfering in the 2016 election? US intelligence told the president time and time again, yes, they were. When reporters asked Trump, or when he used his Twitter account to convey his policy, over and over again, he refused to accept the opinion of his own intelligence people. Rather, he accepted the opinion of President Putin. Now, you could ask yourself, why would an American president do this? You could ask yourself also, why would an American president call American press that was an expression used by Joseph Stalin by Benito Mussolini, by Mao Zedong, but used by the famous dictators of the 20th century. Why would an American president do that and hook himself rhetorically to the vision and the policy of a Russian dictator? Why? We still, to this day, do not know. And the questioner asks about the long term. It's going to take a lot of time for the Biden administration to correct the errors of the Trump administration before it could put itself on a sensible track forward so that US and Russia can work together to solve common problems, of which, unfortunately, there are many before us. But we're not given that chance now. An American reporter asks President Biden if he agrees that Putin is a killer. And Biden responds, yes, he thinks he's a killer. Now, that sets back US-Russian relations a good bit. I think it's an unfortunate question, but it was asked and it was answered. But the relationship now is so tense and so sensitive to any kind of jarring that the smallest thing can have a very large impact. And we have to be very careful now in our relations with Russia and in our relations with China. This is an interesting triangle around the world today, affecting just about anything and everything. The US, Russia, China. And you fiddle around. How can two take advantage of one? And at the moment, Russia and China are trying to take advantage of the US, just as during the Vietnam War, the US and Russia tried to apply pressure on China. So it's a dangerous game. I wish we were not playing it, but we are.
What is your message to our student community, younger professionals who are interested in public service? Politics aside, there's a lot of our students who are seeking to have careers in public service, but the last few years have been a bit more tenuous. What's your message to them?
My message is rather simplistic, but it ends up with powerful consequences. Number one, know as best you can what is going on in the other major countries in the world. And for the United States today, that represents not just Russia and China, but what's going on in Western Europe, which, Vassilis, as you well know, is undergoing profound political and economic change. What is going to emerge out of that? You've got to begin to study that issue. The Russia thing we've talked about, the China thing we haven't talked enough about, but it's a central factor in the way in which the United States will respond and pursue its policies around the world, not just Asia, but all over the world. And so a young person today has a glorious opportunity to learn and then to contribute toward an easing of tensions around the world, to better understanding among people. And I don't want to sound, like what I am, sort of an old man just seeking all good things in the world. It's a realistic judgment. We're in a tough time now. The president spent a good bit of time yesterday, and I agree with him completely, that there is now a struggle in the United States of America between those favoring democracy and those who favor an authoritarian form of government. Now, the president wasn't talking about Democrats and Republicans, but you can draw your own conclusions. The struggle between these two significant political forces is real. It must be faced. And I hope, and I deep down want to believe, that democracy will ultimately prevail. but nothing is written in concrete. Everything is subject to change. And we're in the middle now of profound change within the United States and in many parts of the world, and we better get onto it.
Thank you, Liz. I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah, I'll combine 2. One from Ira Stahl, who took your Kennedy School class as an undergraduate 30 years ago. Asks, how many US...
Did I give her an A?
I think they enjoyed it, regardless of the grade. Asks how many US correspondents were there in Moscow in the early 1960s when you were there, and then also wonders how many do we think there are now? And then Mark Kramer, also looking back at your time there, asks how you overcame the Soviet regime's efforts to keep you from finding out what was going on in Soviet society. So a little behind the scenes.
Let me try to answer Mark's question first. And Mark, it's great to know that you're there somewhere in this technological world. Thank you for the question. As I said earlier, Mark, I was a product not only of what I had picked up about the Soviet Union while in college, but at Harvard, at the Russian Research Center, of benefiting from the teaching of some of the most marvelous professors anywhere at any time, focusing on one country, the Soviet Union. I had learned a great deal. And so when I went to Russia, both as a young diplomat and then dropping that line of work and embracing journalism as a journalist, I believed and believe to this day that the most important thing a journalist can do is to bring to that assignment a knowledge of the country and knowledge of the language of the country, history, politics, economics, the whole works. So when the Russians attempt to sell a particular point of view, what the communists did vigorously, try to sell their image around the world, the journalists so prepared could spot it very quickly and put it in an historical context and then explain to the audience what it is that the Russians are trying to do and whether they might or might not succeed in that kind of an effort. I don't know if you guys still have the time, but just to give you a sense of the way a correspondent operated at a time, Mark, you know this, there was direct censorship of the copy that we submitted for broadcast. Everything had to be cleared by a Soviet censor. So you had to find the language that could get the thought past the censor. And this is an illustration. One day, the Russians were boasting in big propaganda effort that they favored the disarmament of the Red Army, which was absolute nonsense, but that was the line they wanted out. So they took us to a place outside of Minsk. They had 20 Russian soldiers there. They held their rifles up in the air, then threw them down and proclaimed peace and friendship. And then a propaganda guy looked at us and said, there, you have the proof that the Red Army is interested in disarmament. Well, how do you could say this is a lot of baloney, or this is pure propaganda, but then the censor would cut it. And what I did that night of my broadcast was to say, foreign correspondents today were taken for a ride, this time to a place in Minsk where they were told, and then I told the story. That phrase, taken for a ride, meant to an American ear, this is all a lot of baloney. But I couldn't say, because of the censor, this is all a lot of baloney. So I had to tell the American listener some way of getting the thought across. And so it was a steady struggle between the reporter and the censor as to get certain phrases through that the censor didn't know about, but the American listener would know. And but Mark, this was a constant struggle. With words, most important in my judgment, was know your story and know the language. And then you can really have a heads up on how well you're going to do as a reporter.
This is the perfect segue to our last question from Professor Sebastián Royo. Did you ever perceive any conflict of interest in your foreign policy reporting?
Any conflict of interest? No, I had no interest in the Soviet Union whatsoever, other than that it was a fantastic opportunity for a young journalist to try to find out what was going on in this country called the Soviet Union, which I knew about as Russia. And I tried very hard, really, to put my background as a young scholar on Russia, to try to get that into my copy so that people got a richer than usual menu of understanding of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And I must just throw in a conclude. I mean, if I didn't feel the importance of that message, I would most certainly have not have written this book. For me, it is a way of trying to share with the reader the excitement and the challenge of being an American, a journalist in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was quite an experience.
Before I wish you good night and good luck, as you used to close all of your Kalb Report segments, I want to remind all of our viewers, Assignment Russia is Marvin Kalb's new book, published from the Brookings Institution Press. Marvin, on behalf of the Shorenstein Center, the Minda de Gunzburg Center, everyone at Harvard, it's such a pleasure to have you on the screen. I look forward to your third part of the trilogy to take place on campus. I want to wish everyone at home and wherever they're joining us from, be safe. Best of luck, Marvin. It was a pleasure, and thank you so much. Congratulations.
Vassilis, thank you, and thank Liz, and thank all of the wonderful people at the Shorenstein Center, all of whom mean so very much to me, even though I haven't met most of them. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night and good luck.
Good night and good luck. Ciao.